My child, before the sun even began to break through the edges of your window blinds this morning, I was already there with you. I sat beside your bed in the quiet darkness, long before the alarm clock shattered the silence. I watched as your chest rose and fell with the slow, rhythmic breathing of sleep. For a few precious hours, your mind was granted a reprieve from the heavy, suffocating weight you have been carrying for so long. But I also saw the exact moment the grace of sleep slipped away. I saw your eyes open in the dim light, and I watched the painful, familiar realization wash over your face as you remembered the reality of your life. Before your feet even touched the cold hardwood floor, the invisible burden settled right back onto your shoulders. I know how heavy it is. I know that waking up does not feel like a fresh start right now. It simply feels like picking up a massive stone you were only allowed to put down for a few hours. You laid there, staring up at the shadows dancing across the ceiling, wondering how you were going to summon the strength to face another day. You felt the familiar ache in the center of your chest, that tight, hollow sensation that tells you the grief is still there, resting just beneath the surface of your skin. I saw you pull the blankets up a little higher, wishing you could simply hide from the world, from the memories, and from the exhausting demands of an ordinary Tuesday. When you finally pushed yourself up and swung your legs over the edge of the bed, I was right there with you. I saw the way you dragged yourself into the bathroom, your shoulders slumped, your steps heavy with a weariness that no amount of sleep can cure. When you stood before the mirror and turned on the harsh overhead light, you did not look at your own reflection with kindness. You leaned your hands against the cold porcelain edge of the sink, staring into your own tired eyes, taking inventory of the toll this silent suffering is taking on you. You splashed cold water on your face, as if you could somehow wash away the deep, hidden exhaustion that has seeped into your very bones. I saw you rehearse your mask. It is a subtle thing, something no one else would ever notice, but I see it clearly. I watched you practice the gentle, polite smile you will use when your coworkers ask how your evening was. I heard you whisper the words under your breath, "I'm fine, just a little tired," making sure your tone sounded light and convincing. You are becoming so incredibly skilled at hiding your pain from the world, carefully constructing walls to ensure no one asks too many questions. You brush your hair, you button your shirt, and you expertly cover the dark circles under your eyes, preparing to step out your front door and pretend that everything is perfectly normal. But I know the truth, my child. I know that beneath that brave, composed exterior, your heart is bruised and bleeding. I am El Roy, the God who sees you. When the rest of the world sees a strong, capable person handling the responsibilities of life with grace, I see the fragile, terrified child who just wants to sit down and weep. I see the massive chasm between the confident face you show the public and the broken spirit you hide behind closed doors. You walk through crowded grocery stores. You sit in busy traffic. And you stand in the middle of a room full of chattering people, yet you feel entirely, profoundly alone. You moved into the kitchen, the silence of the house pressing in on you like a physical weight. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the gentle dripping of the coffee maker were the only sounds keeping you company. I watched you stare out the kitchen window into the gray morning light as the coffee brewed, your mind wandering to a place of deep hurt. Your hands were wrapped tightly around your favorite ceramic mug, seeking whatever small, fleeting warmth you could find. You went through the motions of your morning routine on complete autopilot, pouring the coffee, wiping down the counters, packing your lunch into a small paper bag. These ordinary tasks act as a fragile life raft, something simple and predictable for you to cling to when the currents of your mind threaten to pull you under. As you stood alone in your quiet kitchen, you whispered a silent, fractured question into the empty room. You didn't even form the words out loud, but your spirit cried out, wondering if anyone in the universe truly understood the depth of your secret agony. You wonder if your suffering is entirely invisible. You wonder if the tears you have swallowed down and the panic you have fought off in the middle of the night have simply evaporated into nothingness, unseen and unrecorded. My beloved child, I want you to listen to me carefully. Not a single tear you have shed in the dark has been wasted or missed. I have caught every single one. When you have sat in your car in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel and waiting for the tears to stop before walking inside, I was sitting right beside you. When you have stood in the shower, letting the water run over your face so you could cry without leaving a trace, I was holding you. The world may be completely blind to your silent grief, easily fooled by the "I'm fine" you offer them, but nothing that has wounded your heart has escaped my loving, compassionate eyes. You finished your coffee and set the empty mug in the sink, taking a deep, shuddering breath to steady your nerves. It was time to leave. It was time to step out into the daylight and perform for the world. You walked down the short hallway toward the front door, feeling the familiar, nauseating knot of anxiety twisting in your stomach. The sheer exhaustion of knowing you have to pretend for another 8 hours almost brought you to your knees. It feels entirely unfair that the rest of the world gets to carry on with their ordinary, happy lives, while you are trapped in a silent, invisible storm. You reach the entryway table to grab your keys and your coat, preparing to cross the threshold into the busy, demanding world. You told yourself that today would be a good day. You told yourself that you would not think about the past, that you would push the memories down so deep they could not possibly reach you. You promised yourself that you would stay busy, stay focused, and outrun the ache. But as you reach for your keys in the small, woven basket on the console table, your fingers brushed against something else. It was tucked away in the corner, partially hidden beneath a stack of unopened mail. But the moment your skin touched it, a shock wave of cold dread traveled straight up your arm. You froze. Your hand hovered over the basket, your breathing suddenly shallow and rapid. Slowly, almost against your own will, you pushed the letters aside and looked down at the object resting in the shadows. It was just a simple silver watch with a cracked leather band. To anyone else, it would be a piece of junk, a broken trinket destined for the trash. But to you, it was an anchor connected to a chain of devastating memories. You stared at the worn leather, and instantly, the carefully constructed walls you had built around your heart this morning began to crumble into dust. The quiet sanctuary of your hallway faded away, and you were violently pulled backward in time, back to the exact moment the world beneath your feet gave way. The rhythmic ticking of that silver watch may have stopped years ago, but in your mind, the sound is as deafening as thunder. You closed your eyes, and suddenly, you were no longer standing in your quiet, sunlit hallway. You were back in that dimly lit room, standing on the faded rug, listening to the sharp, terrifying click of the heavy wooden door shutting tight. The moment that latch fell into place, the atmosphere in the room shifted, growing cold and suffocating. You were trapped in a space where the world's watchful eyes could not penetrate. A hidden chamber where the truth was twisted and your heart was systematically broken. I was in that room with you, my child. I stood between you and the one you had trusted so completely. I saw the way their face hardened, the way the charming, gentle mask they wore for the public simply melted away, revealing a coldness that sent a shock of pure terror straight down your spine. For years, this was the person you had leaned on. This was the individual who had promised to protect you, the one who had spoken words of loyalty and love in front of audiences, family, and friends. To the rest of the world, they were a pillar of strength and kindness. But in the shadows of that locked room, they became your deepest source of agony. I heard every single word they threw at you like jagged stones. I heard the unfair accusations, the cruel manipulation, and the devastating rewriting of history that left you breathless and dizzy. They spoke with such cold precision, deliberately aiming for the most tender, vulnerable parts of your soul, parts they only knew about, because you had bravely entrusted them with your deepest secrets. You stood there, your hands trembling at your sides, paralyzed by the sheer, unimaginable betrayal. Your mind desperately tried to make sense of the sudden cruelty, searching for a reason, an excuse, a misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. It was a calculated, deliberate wounding, executed in perfect, isolating privacy. You tried to speak. I remember how you opened your mouth, your voice nothing more than a ragged whisper, pleading for them to stop, pleading for the person you thought you knew to return. But they only leaned closer, their voice dropping to a harsh, quiet hiss that echoed off the walls. They told you that you were entirely alone. They told you that no one would ever believe your side of the story. They told you that your pain was your own fault, projecting their own shame and failure squarely onto your shoulders. And then, with a final dismissive glare, they unclasped that silver watch, a gift you had once given them in a moment of pure, joyful celebration, and dropped it onto the table between you. The sharp clatter of metal against wood sounded like a gavel striking a block, finalizing the death of your trust. They turned their back, unlocked the door, and walked out into the bright daylight, instantly slipping their charming public persona back on, as if nothing had happened. When the door closed behind them, your knees finally buckled. I watched you sink to the floor, gasping for air as the full weight of the betrayal crashed over you. You gathered your arms around your chest, trying to physically hold your shattered heart together. The silence in the room was absolute, pressing against your eardrums, magnifying the profound injustice of what had just occurred. How could someone do this? How could someone smile so warmly in the light and strike so mercilessly in the dark? My precious child, the injustice you suffered that day burns in my own heart. Do not ever believe the lie that your pain went unnoticed just because no earthly witness was present in that room. The dark is as light to me, and every closed door is wide open before my throne. Earthly injustice, no matter how perfectly concealed by clever lies and public charm, does not erase the reality of heavenly justice. I am the God who binds up the broken-hearted and meticulously dresses their wounds. I sat on that floor with you as you wept until your throat was raw. I caught the tears that fell onto the faded rug, and I recorded every cruel, deceitful word spoken against you. The perpetrator may have walked away thinking they had successfully hidden their cruelty, but nothing is hidden from my sight. Their mask does not fool me. Yet the hardest part of your journey began in the days and weeks that followed. You were faced with an agonizing choice. You looked at the wreckage of the relationship. You looked at the immense popularity and influence of the one who had hurt you, and you calculated the devastating cost of speaking the truth. You knew that raising your voice would invite a brutal war. You knew that people would doubt you, that friendships would be torn apart, and that the charming manipulator would easily turn the crowd against you. You looked at the sheer exhaustion already settling into your bones, and you realized you simply did not have the strength to fight a battle where the enemy held all the public sympathy. So, you made a choice. A heartbreaking, desperate choice for survival. You picked up that silver watch. You swallowed the burning lump of injustice lodged in your throat. And you chose to lock the truth away behind your own tightly sealed doors. You decided to absorb the blow, allowing them to walk away with their reputation completely intact, while you quietly bled out in the shadows. You told yourself it was the noble thing to do. You told yourself that staying quiet was the only way to keep the peace, to protect the people around you from the messy, collateral damage of the truth. But keeping that kind of toxic secret is like trying to hold a burning ember barehanded. It has slowly, methodically scorched your spirit. It has forced you into a life of exhausting vigilance, constantly terrified that someone might accidentally brush against the raw nerve of your hidden grief. Every time you see them praised by others, every time you hear their names spoken with admiration, a fresh wave of nausea washes over you. You smile and nod, playing the part of the gracious acquaintance, while inside, your heart screams against the towering unfairness of it all. You have carried this heavy, agonizing stone of silent suffering for so long that you have begun to believe it is permanently grafted to your soul. You have convinced yourself that this quiet, desperate endurance is simply the price you must pay to survive in a broken world. But I never meant for you to carry this crushing weight alone, my child. I never designed your shoulders to bear the immense burden of someone else's unconfessed sin. You have been so strong for so long. You have protected others at the immense expense of your own peace, choosing to be the vault that holds the ugliest truths of a person who never once apologized. Standing there in your hallway, the cold metal of the watch resting under your fingertips, the memory is so vivid you can almost smell the dust in that old room. The pain is so sharp, so immediately present, that your breathing hitches in your chest. A single hot tear escapes the corner of your eye, tracing a slow, familiar path down your cheek. The overwhelming urge to sink right there onto the hardwood floor and surrender to the grief is pulling at you with tremendous force. Suddenly, a sharp, rhythmic sound shatters the heavy silence of the morning. Knock, knock, knock. You gasp, yanking your hand back from the basket as if the watch had suddenly caught fire. Your head snaps toward the heavy wooden door of your own home. The sound is startling, completely unexpected at this early hour. Your heart, already racing from the adrenaline of the painful memory, now kicks into a frantic, panicked rhythm against your ribs. Knock, knock, knock. Someone is standing on your front porch. Someone is waiting on the other side of the wood, demanding your attention, threatening to pull you completely out of the shadows and back into the demanding light of the present moment. You squeeze your eyes shut for one brief, desperate second. You furiously wipe the dampness from your cheeks with the back of your trembling hand, taking a deep, shuddering breath. You cannot let anyone see you like this. You quickly push the unopened mail back over the silver watch, burying the past once again in the darkness of the woven basket. You paste that familiar fragile mask of polite composure back onto your face, clear your tight throat, and reach for the cold brass handle of the doorknob. You turn the brass handle and pull the heavy wood inward, forcing the corners of your mouth to lift into a bright, welcoming curve. Standing on your front porch in the crisp morning air was simply a neighbor, holding a small package that had been mistakenly placed in their mailbox. They smiled warmly, completely oblivious to the fact that just seconds before, you were standing in your hallway on the very edge of an emotional cliff. I watched as you instinctively stepped into the light, accepting the package with a polite, airy laugh. You exchanged a few hollow sentences about the changing weather and the upcoming weekend, your voice perfectly steady, betraying absolutely none of the terror that was still actively racing through your veins. When you finally waved goodbye and pushed the door shut, the silence of the house rushed back in to surround you. The moment the lock clicked into place, the fragile smile dissolved from your face, and your shoulders dropped under the staggering, invisible weight of your own secret. The physical effort of that 2-minute interaction had entirely drained whatever small emotional reserves you had managed to gather from a restless night of sleep. You leaned your forehead against the cool wood of the door, closing your eyes as a wave of pure, unadulterated exhaustion washed over you. My child, it takes a monumental amount of energy to pretend you are not bleeding. As you moved through the rest of your day, I walked right beside you, watching the quiet, devastating toll this hidden burden was taking on your physical body. I saw the way you rubbed your temples in the car, fighting back the dull, persistent ache that had settled securely behind your eyes. I noticed how your jaw remained tightly clenched as you navigated through the morning traffic, your knuckles white on the steering wheel, your mind entirely consumed by the frantic, endless task of keeping your guard up. Hiding a deep, unhealed wound is not merely an emotional struggle. It is a profound physical exertion. You are living in a constant, draining state of hypervigilance. Every time a phone rings, your heart stutters. Every time someone mentions a name or a place remotely connected to your past, your stomach drops, and you have to perform agonizing mental gymnastics to ensure your face remains completely neutral. You are entirely exhausted, my dear one. Your soul is utterly depleted from playing the role of the strong, unaffected survivor. I have whispered to your spirit so many times, offering you the very rest your soul is desperately craving. I have gently invited you to come to me, weary and heavy laden, promising that I would take the crushing weight from your shoulders and give you deep, abiding rest. But you are still gripping the pain so tightly, terrified to let it go. You mistakenly believe that burying the memory is the same thing as overcoming it. But you cannot heal what you refuse to hand over to me. By locking the betrayal in the darkest corner of your heart, you haven't protected yourself from the pain. You have simply allowed the bitterness to take root in the soil of your isolation. and roots that grow in the dark will eventually find a way to break through the surface. That afternoon, the immense pressure you had been containing finally reached a boiling point. You were standing in the break room at work, staring blankly at the slow drip of the coffee machine, desperate for anything to help you push through the final hours of the day. A well-meaning acquaintance walked into the small room, humming a cheerful tune. They poured a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, launching into a casual, breezy conversation about life. You offered a few polite, non-committal murmurs, just trying to survive the interaction so you could retreat to the safety of your desk. But then, the conversation shifted. In completely innocent ignorance, your acquaintance brought up the very person who had wounded you so deeply. They smiled broadly, their eyes lighting up with genuine admiration. I was just listening to them speak the other day, the acquaintance remarked, stirring cream into their cup. They just have such a wonderful, generous heart. It's so incredibly inspiring how they always put other people first. Don't you think? The words hit you like a physical blow to the chest. For years, you had swallowed that exact same praise from dozens of different people, nodding along while your internal world was screaming in protest. Usually, your practiced discipline held strong. Usually, you could force a tight smile, agree politely, and excuse yourself before the nausea became too overwhelming. But not today. Today, the sheer exhaustion of pretending had completely eroded your defenses. The suppressed bitterness you had worked so hard to keep contained suddenly flared up like gasoline thrown onto an open flame. The gross, agonizing injustice of their statement, praising the generosity of the very person who had ruthlessly stolen your peace, was simply too much to bear in your weakened state. Before your rational mind could stop you, the mask slipped, and the ugly, raw truth of your unhealed heart leaked out into the open. A generous heart, you snapped, your voice suddenly sharp and jagged, slicing through the comfortable quiet of the room. You didn't yell, but the venom in your tone was unmistakable. You turned to face your acquaintance, your hands trembling slightly at your sides. People are rarely who they pretend to be in public. You shouldn't be so quick to believe a performance. The silence that instantly crashed down over the small break room was deafening. The acquaintance blinked, their cheerful smile vanishing, replaced immediately by a look of sheer shock and profound discomfort. They took a slight, unconscious step back from you, entirely bewildered by the sudden hostility radiating from someone they had always known to be quiet and polite. The moment you saw the judgment and confusion in their eyes, the harsh reality of what you had just done washed over you like a bucket of ice water. A hot, agonizing flush of shame burned its way up your neck and across your cheeks. You had let the bitterness win. You had allowed the secret poison inside of you to spill out and burn someone who had absolutely nothing to do with your pain. I'm sorry, you stammered quickly, your voice barely above a ragged whisper as you broke eye contact, staring intensely at the floor. I have a terrible headache. Excuse me. You didn't wait for a reply. You practically fled from the room, abandoning your coffee on the counter, your heart hammering a frantic, guilty rhythm against your ribs. You retreated to the lonely sanctuary of your car a few hours later, the events of the afternoon replaying on a merciless, agonizing loop in your mind. The drive home was a blur of unshed tears and devastating self-reproach. You gripped the steering wheel so tightly your fingers ached, feeling more alienated and misunderstood than you had in years. You realized with a sinking, terrifying dread that the secret was not just hurting you anymore. It was actively changing you. It was twisting your gentle spirit into something cynical, angry, and unrecognizable. You had successfully protected the reputation of the one who betrayed you, but in the process, you were slowly destroying your own soul. When you finally pulled into your driveway, the sun had already begun to dip below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the front of your quiet home. You turned the key in the ignition, cutting the engine, but you did not immediately open the door. You sat there in the heavy silence of the vehicle, staring blankly at your own front door, feeling entirely hollowed out. The world outside was moving on, completely unaware of the raging storm you were failing to navigate. And the thought of stepping inside your empty house to spend another evening entirely alone with your thoughts felt like a punishment you could no longer endure. You finally forced your hand toward the door handle, pushing it open and stepping out into the cool evening air. The walk up your concrete driveway felt like a journey of 1,000 miles. Your legs were incredibly heavy, completely weighed down by the emotional exhaustion of the day and the terrifying realization of how deeply the bitterness had begun to change you. I walked closely beside you as you fumbled with your keys, watching your trembling fingers struggle to find the right one in the fading twilight. When the deadbolt finally clicked, and you pushed the front door open, you were immediately met with a wall of absolute, suffocating silence. You didn't reach for the light switch. You simply let the heavy wooden door swing shut behind you, sealing you inside the dark, empty house. For most people, coming home is a relief, a safe haven from the demands of the world. But for you, the sheer emptiness of these rooms only serves as a massive, echoing amplifier for your hidden pain. Without the distractions of your coworkers, the noise of the traffic, or the frantic demands of your daily schedule, there was absolutely nothing left to drown out the loud, agonizing voice of your own grief. You dropped your purse onto the floor with a dull thud, not even bothering to pick it up when it tipped over and spilled its contents onto the rug. You slipped your coat off your shoulders and let it fall right there in the entryway, shedding the physical layers of your armor, because the energy required to hang it in the closet simply did not exist. You moved slowly into the living room, a solitary figure navigating entirely by the pale, silver moonlight spilling through the window blinds. The silence in the room was not peaceful. It was oppressive. It pressed against your eardrums and tightened around your throat. In the quiet dark, the memory of your sharp, angry outburst in the break room replayed in your mind, burning you with a fresh wave of shame. You saw the shocked, alienated look on your acquaintance's face all over again. You realized that the protective walls you had built to keep the pain out were now acting as a prison, locking you inside with a poison that was slowly turning you against the very people you interacted with. The loneliness of that realization was completely paralyzing. You reached the center of the living room, but you didn't sit on the couch. Instead, your knees simply gave out. You sank down onto the soft carpet, crossing your arms tightly over your chest, pulling your knees up as if you were trying to make yourself as physically small as possible. You sat there on the floor of your empty living room, the absolute lowest valley you have walked through yet, entirely consumed by a profound, desperate isolation. And then, the anger shifted. It moved away from the person who had betrayed you, away from the well-meaning acquaintance at work, and it pointed directly upward. It pointed straight at me. "Where were you?" You whispered into the dark, your voice trembling and thick, with unshed tears. The question hung in the empty room, raw and bleeding. For years, you had been too afraid to ask it. You had been taught that you must always be perfectly polite when addressing your Creator, that you should never question the Almighty, and that anger is a sign of failing faith. But tonight, the desperation eclipsed the fear. "You said you see everything!" you cried out, your voice growing louder, cracking under the intense strain of your broken heart. You are supposed to be the God who protects. If you saw what happened in that room, if you heard every single lie they told, why didn't you stop it? Why did you let them walk away perfectly fine, while I have to sit here in the dark, entirely destroyed? My precious child, you had no idea how closely I was leaning in to listen to you in that exact moment. I was not offended by your anger. I was not intimidated by your shouting, nor was I disappointed by your lack of a perfectly polished prayer. Religion may have told you to hide your messy, complicated emotions, but I am your Father. I want your profound, unfiltered truth. I created the capacity of your heart, and I am entirely capable of holding your deepest frustrations. I welcomed your agonizing questions because, for the very first time in years, you were finally talking to me about the secret you had tried so desperately to carry entirely on your own. "It isn't fair," you sobbed, burying your face in your trembling hands. "It isn't fair that I have to carry this. It isn't fair that they get to be celebrated while I am suffocating." The dam completely broke. The fragile, carefully constructed mask you had worn for so many exhausting months shattered into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces on your living room floor. You wept with a fierce, violent intensity. It was the kind of crying that aches in the very bottom of your ribs, the kind that leaves you gasping for breath in the quiet dark. You rocked back and forth on the carpet, completely surrendering to the overwhelming tide of grief, betrayal, and total exhaustion. You let out every unsaid word, every swallowed defense, and every silent scream that had been trapped inside your throat since the moment that heavy wooden door was locked behind you. I was right there on the floor with you, The scriptures promise that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and that he saves those who are crushed in spirit. This is not merely a poetic metaphor, my child. It is a profound, literal reality. In the moments when you felt the most abandoned, the most entirely alone in your empty house, my presence was actively wrapping around you. I did not rush you. I did not tell you to quiet down or to dry your tears. I simply sat with you in the wreckage of your pain, allowing you to empty the massive, toxic reservoir of sorrow that had been slowly drowning your soul. Finally, as the physical exertion of your weeping began to take its toll, the frantic sobbing slowed into quiet, rhythmic gasps. Your hands fell away from your face, resting limply on the carpet. You stared blankly at the shadows stretching across the floorboards, entirely hollowed out. "I can't do this anymore," you whispered, the words barely carrying past your own lips. "I am so tired. God, I am just so incredibly tired. I cannot carry this stone for one more day." It was a total, absolute surrender. It was the messy, beautiful admission of your own profound limitations. You had finally reached the very end of your own strength, the place where you could no longer rely on your own endurance or your own ability to pretend. You had completely emptied yourself, and in doing so, you inadvertently created the necessary space for me to begin a genuine work of healing. You sat there in the quiet for a long time, the only sound in the room, the slow, ragged intake of your own breathing. The heavy, accusing silence that had greeted you when you first walked through the door had subtly shifted. It was still quiet, but the atmosphere in the room no longer felt quite so empty. The suffocating pressure in your chest had marginally lessened, replaced by the strange, floating numbness that always follows a massive, emotional release. You sniffled, wiping your damp, swollen cheeks with the sleeve of your shirt. You slowly lifted your heavy head, letting your eyes adjust entirely to the dim lighting of the living room. The moonlight was cutting a sharp, diagonal path across the floor, illuminating the bottom edge of the large wooden bookshelf that stood against the far wall. Your gaze naturally followed the beam of light, wandering aimlessly across the lower shelves, past the old photo albums, and the neat rows of forgotten novels. But then, your eyes caught on a specific shape, resting on the middle shelf. It was pushed back slightly, hidden behind a decorative candle, its edges completely coated in a thin, undeniable layer of dust from months of profound neglect. It was an old, leather-bound Bible. You hadn't opened its pages since long before the betrayal happened. You had quietly decided that the words inside were meant for people whose lives were neat and orderly, not for someone wrestling with the kind of dark, complicated secret you were carrying. But now, sitting exhausted on your living room floor, completely stripped of your pride and your defenses, the worn leather cover seemed to be calling out to you from the shadows, offering a quiet, gentle invitation to the weary. You didn't move right away. For a long, suspended moment, you simply stared at the spine of that old Bible, letting the silence of the room settle heavily around you once again. The sheer thought of standing up felt like an impossible mountain to climb. Your body was entirely drained, your muscles aching from the violent physical exertion of your weeping. Yet, there was a gentle, persistent tug at your spirit, a quiet, undeniable whisper, cutting through the thick fog of your despair. I was drawing you, my child. I was gently guiding your weary eyes toward the only true source of comfort that could ever reach the deepest, most hidden corners of your wounded heart. Slowly, using the edge of the coffee table for support, you pushed yourself up from the carpet. Your legs trembled slightly as you took the few short steps across the living room. You reached out, your hand hovering over the shelf for a brief second before your fingers finally wrapped around the worn, familiar leather. As you pulled the Bible from its resting place, a faint cloud of dust caught the moonlight, swirling silently in the air between you and the window. It had been so long. You ran your thumb across the embossed letters on the cover, feeling a sudden, sharp pang of guilt mixed with the lingering anger. You wondered if you even had the right to hold this book after pushing me away for so many exhausting months. You carried it back to the couch and sat down, the springs groaning softly under your weight. The room was still cloaked in shadows, so you reached over and clicked on the small, brass reading lamp resting on the end table. A warm, golden circle of light immediately spilled across your lap, pushing back the oppressive darkness that had been suffocating you all evening. It was a small, physical shift in the room, but it mirrored the profound spiritual reality I was beginning to unfold within you. The light shines in the darkness, my child, and the darkness has not and will never overcome it. You held the book in your lap, entirely unopened, as a fierce battle waged within your exhausted mind. The cynical, protective walls you had built were screaming at you to put it down. Doubt, that relentless familiar enemy, began to whisper its toxic lies into your ear. It told you that this book was just a collection of ancient pages, completely detached from the very real, very modern agony you were suffering. It told you that God might care about the grand, sweeping tragedies of the world, but he certainly did not have the time or the inclination to care about a secret betrayal hidden behind a closed wooden door. You wrestled with the terrifying thought that if you opened these pages and found nothing but empty, unfeeling silence, it would finally break whatever fragile sliver of sanity you had left. I watched the conflict contort your face. I saw you trace the edge of the pages, your bottom lip trembling as you fought the urge to simply turn off the lamp and surrender to the night. You didn't want to be disappointed again. You had already placed your absolute trust in someone who had looked you in the eye and shattered your world. The thought of trusting me, of making yourself vulnerable to heaven, felt entirely terrifying. Please, you whispered to the empty room, your voice so fragile it barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the lamplight. Please, if you are there, just show me. Show me that I am not crazy. Show me that you see it. With a deep, shuddering breath, you let the Bible fall open. You didn't search for a specific chapter or rely on a carefully memorized reference. You simply let the worn binding part where it naturally wanted to, the delicate thin pages fluttering softly under the warm glow of the lamp. Your eyes scanned the text, initially unable to focus through the lingering blur of your tears. You blinked them away, and your gaze landed on the middle of the page, drawn by my invisible loving hand to the exact words I had preserved through thousands of years, just for you to read in this precise moment. You began to read the ancient poetry of the Psalms. You read the words of a king who was intimately acquainted with betrayal, a man who had hidden in dark caves while the people he trusted most turned against him and celebrated his ruin. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. You read the verse once. Then you read it again, your eyes moving slowly across the ink. You stopped on the word crushed. It was such a specific, violent word, completely encapsulating the exact sensation that had been living inside your chest for months. You hadn't just been sad. You had been entirely flattened by the weight of the injustice. The fact that this specific word was sitting right there, written in plain ink, felt like a direct, undeniable validation of your hidden pain. You kept reading, your fingers slowly tracing the lines of text, as if you were reading Braille, trying to absorb the truth through your very skin. You read about how I search the heart, how I perceive your thoughts from afar, and how I am completely familiar with all your ways. As you read, the agonizing question that had been tormenting you, does anyone know what really happened, was finally answered. I saw it. I knew it. I was close. A subtle, miraculous shift began to occur within you. It was not a sudden, overwhelming explosion of joy, nor did it instantly erase the devastating reality of the betrayal. No, it was something much quieter, much more enduring. It was a tiny, fragile spark of comfort igniting in the absolute center of your chest. It felt as though a cool, gentle breeze had finally blown into the suffocating, stale air of your locked emotional vault. The relentless, frantic buzzing of anxiety in your mind began to slow down. For the first time all day, you realized your jaw was no longer tightly clenched. Your shoulders, which had been raised defensively toward your ears since the moment you woke up, finally dropped a fraction of an inch. You leaned back against the cushions of the couch, resting the open Bible against your heart, closing your eyes as the profound, undeniable truth washed over you. You were not carrying a secret that had escaped the notice of heaven. The injustice was not a permanently forgotten footnote in the history of the world. It was fully known, deeply grieved, and entirely held by your Creator. Thank you, you whispered into the quiet room, the anger entirely gone from your voice, replaced by a raw, exhausted humility. Thank you for seeing me. You sat there in the golden circle of lamplight for a long time, allowing the gentle peace to settle over your frayed, exhausted nerves. You didn't need to read any further tonight. That one single drop of living water was enough to sustain you in the desert. Eventually, the sheer physical toll of the day caught up with you. Your eyelids grew heavy, and you curled up right there on the couch, pulling a woven throw blanket over your legs, keeping the old Bible resting securely against your chest. For the first time in months, you drifted into a deep, uninterrupted sleep, untormented by the vivid, terrifying replays of the closed room. You slept securely in the knowledge that you were seen. The morning sun broke gently through the window blinds, casting a bright, cheerful pattern across the living room floor. You stirred, blinking against the sudden brightness, feeling a strange, unfamiliar sensation. It took you a moment to recognize it. It was lightness. The crushing, suffocating boulder of isolation had been slightly lifted. You sat up, carefully placing the Bible on the coffee table, and stretched your stiff muscles. You felt incredibly fragile, like a patient taking their very first steps after a devastating illness. But there was a distinct quiet hope anchoring your spirit. You walked into the kitchen to start the coffee, moving with a slower, much more deliberate pace than the frantic rushing of yesterday morning. You poured the water, watching the steam rise, actively choosing to hold on to the tiny spark of faith you had found in the dark. You whispered a short, simple prayer, asking me to help you guard this newly discovered peace. You felt ready. You felt for the very first time that you might actually be capable of healing. But the journey of healing is rarely a straight, unbroken line, my child. Just as you poured your first cup of coffee, feeling the warm ceramic against your palms, the sharp, cheerful ringtone of your cell phone shattered the quiet calm of the morning. You walked casually over to the counter, expecting to see a text from a coworker or a reminder for an upcoming appointment. But when your eyes locked onto the glowing screen, the fragile, newly formed peace in your chest completely stopped. The name flashing brightly in the center of the glass was the absolute last person on earth you ever expected to see. The name flashing brightly in the center of the glass was the absolute last person on earth you ever expected to see. It was Claire. For a long, suspended moment, you simply stared at the glowing letters, completely paralyzed by a sudden, icy wave of shock. Claire was an old, dear friend, someone whose laughter had once filled the rooms of your home on a regular basis. But more importantly, she was someone intricately tied to your past. She was deeply woven into the very social circle you had frantically abandoned. And crucially, she still held immense admiration for the person who had shattered your world behind that closed door. You had not spoken to her in over a year, having slowly and deliberately let the friendship fade into a safe, distant silence to protect your secret. Your thumb hovered over the screen as the phone vibrated against the granite countertop, emitting a relentless, demanding hum. The newly found peace that had just begun to settle in your chest felt incredibly fragile, like a delicate piece of glass teetering on the edge of a table. If you answered, you risked shattering it entirely. If you ignored it, the anxiety of wondering why she was calling would surely consume your entire day. With a trembling hand, you swiped the green button and lifted the phone to your ear, forcing your voice to sound remarkably casual. "Hello?" you answered, your throat suddenly tight and dry. "I know it's so early, and I am so sorry for calling without warning." Claire's voice was just as bright and musical as you remembered, bursting through the speaker with an energetic warmth that felt entirely foreign in your quiet house. "But my company sent me into town for a last-minute conference, and I am literally 2 streets over from your neighborhood. Please tell me you have time for a quick cup of coffee." I watched the color completely drain from your face, my child. Your mind raced, desperately searching for a polite excuse, a prior commitment, any plausible reason to keep your front door securely locked. You looked around the kitchen, your eyes darting from the coffee maker to the window, feeling cornered by the sudden, overwhelming pressure of her proximity. But the ingrained habit of accommodating others was too strong to break on such short notice. "Of course," you heard yourself say, your voice sounding incredibly distant, as if someone else were speaking the words for you. "I'm home. Come on over." You hung up the phone and immediately gripped the edge of the counter, squeezing your eyes shut as a fresh wave of panic washed over you. You had barely managed to survive a brief conversation with a neighbor yesterday. How were you supposed to sit across the table from someone who was so deeply connected to the source of your greatest pain? You scrambled around the living room, frantically hiding the worn leather Bible beneath a stack of magazines, terrified that its presence might invite questions you were not prepared to answer. You rushed into the bathroom, splashing cold water onto your cheeks, vigorously rubbing your face to bring some color back to your pale skin, hastily reconstructing the heavy, exhausting mask of the strong survivor. 10 minutes later, the doorbell rang. You opened the door, and there she was. Claire pulled you into a tight, familiar embrace, completely oblivious to the fact that your entire body was rigid with unspoken terror. She stepped into your entryway, her cheerful energy filling the quiet space, chatting enthusiastically about the traffic, her flight, and how much she had missed you. You nodded and smiled, playing the role of the gracious host, ushering her into the kitchen and pouring a second cup of coffee. I was standing right there in the kitchen with you, intimately aware of the frantic, terrified rhythm of your heart. You were so afraid that this uninvited guest was going to destroy the tiny glimmer of faith you had found in the dark hours of the morning. But my ways are not your ways, my beloved. I did not allow Claire to knock on your door to punish you or to strip away your peace. I brought her there because true, lasting healing cannot happen in a vacuum. You have isolated yourself for so long, mistakenly believing that keeping everyone at arm's length is the only way to remain safe. But to heal the deep, festering wounds of the heart, you must eventually allow a little bit of light and air to reach them. You handed Claire the warm mug, and the two of you sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation remained wonderfully, safely superficial. You talked about her new job, the weather, and old memories that held no sharp edges. You began to relax, just a fraction of an inch, your shoulders dropping slightly, as you foolishly convinced yourself that you might actually get through this visit unscathed. And then, the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. Claire took a slow sip of her coffee, her bright eyes softening into a look of genuine, reflective admiration. "I actually ran into them last week at a charity dinner," Claire mentioned casually, speaking the specific name you had banned from your own vocabulary. "They were receiving an award for community service. It's just incredible, isn't it? How someone can give so much of themselves to help others. They asked about you, by the way. They said they missed your friendship." The words hit you with the force of a physical blow. The sheer, absolute audacity of the lie stole the oxygen right out of your lungs. The person who had locked you in a room, systematically verbally abused you, and threatened you into silence, was standing on stages receiving awards for their kindness, and then using your name to further their public image of benevolence. In an instant, you were violently pulled back into that dark room. The bitter, suppressed anger that you had surrendered on the living room floor the night before suddenly roared back to life, flooding your veins with pure, hot adrenaline. Your hands began to shake so violently that the coffee inside your mug sloshed dangerously close to the rim. You quickly set it down on the wooden table with a sharp, heavy clatter that made Claire blink in surprise. You stared down at the dark liquid in the cup, fighting the absolute hardest battle of your life. Every single protective instinct inside of you was screaming at you to lash out, to scream the ugly, devastating truth right into Claire's oblivious face. You wanted to tear down the pedestal she had placed them on. You wanted to describe, in agonizing detail, the cruelty you had endured, to force her to see the monster hiding behind the charming smile. You opened your mouth, a sharp, bitter retort sitting right on the edge of your tongue. "Do not let the bitterness win," I whispered gently to your spirit, wrapping my presence tightly around your trembling shoulders. "Do not let their sin dictate your reaction." You closed your eyes, biting the inside of your cheek so hard you could taste the faint metallic tang of blood. You forced your lips together, trapping the angry words securely behind your teeth. You managed to stay quiet, but the physical toll of holding the truth inside was completely undeniable. Your chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths, and a single uninvited tear slipped past your eyelashes, tracking a hot line down your pale cheek. You had successfully maintained your silence, but the mask of the strong, unaffected survivor was completely, irreversibly cracked. In the scriptures, I inspired the Apostle Paul to write a simple, profound instruction. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. I never intended for you to carry the massive, suffocating weight of this betrayal entirely on your own. You were designed for community, for connection, for the safety of trusted relationships. The enemy of your soul wants you to believe that if you ever let your pain be seen, it will destroy the people around you or cause them to turn against you. But holding on to the secret is what is truly destroying you. The kitchen was completely silent, save for the ticking of the clock on the wall. The long, uncomfortable pause stretched between you and Claire, thick with the unspoken tension of the moment. You refused to look up from the table, bracing yourself for the inevitable questions, the confusion, and the awkward retreat you expected her to make. You were certain she would be offended by your strange behavior, or try to aggressively defend the person she so deeply admired. But she didn't. Claire did not ask what was wrong. She did not fill the silence with nervous chatter, or back away from the sudden, heavy emotional storm that had just entered your home. Instead, I watched as she slowly set her own coffee mug down on the table. She reached across the small distance separating the two of you, her movements incredibly gentle and deliberate. Without saying a single word, Claire placed her warm, steady hand directly over your cold, trembling ones. The warmth of Claire's hand resting over yours felt like a sudden, jarring intrusion into the freezing fortress you had built around your heart. For the first few terrifying seconds, your mind violently rejected the comfort. Every single survival instinct you possessed, honed to razor-sharp perfection by months of hypervigilance, screamed at you to pull away. You wanted to snatch your hands back, stand up from the kitchen table, and immediately build a fresh, impenetrable wall of polite deflection. You had spent so long completely terrified of being truly seen that the simple, unearned kindness of a friend's touch felt inexplicably dangerous. You braced yourself, your shoulders stiffening under your sweater, waiting for the inevitable interrogation. You expected her to demand an immediate explanation. You prepared yourself for a barrage of defensive questions, assuming she would naturally try to protect the pristine, public reputation of the person she had just been praising. But she didn't. I watched as the heavy silence stretched out between the two of you, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the ragged, uneven sound of your own breathing. Claire simply sat there, her thumb gently tracing the tense knuckles of your right hand. She was not rushing you. She was not trying to force her way into your locked emotional vault. She was simply waiting on the front porch of your heart, quietly proving that she was a safe place to land. The battle raging inside your mind was utterly deafening, my child. On one side stood the paralyzing fear of being judged, the terrifying possibility that if you spoke the truth, she would not believe you. You were deeply afraid that she would look at you with the same cold, dismissive eyes that had haunted your nightmares since that terrible day. But on the other side of that battle was a desperate, agonizing need to be understood. You were so incredibly tired of carrying the crushing weight of the secret You were drowning in the lonely ocean of your own silence, and Claire's hand felt like a lifeline suddenly tossed into the freezing water. "Let her in," I whispered gently to your trembling spirit, my presence filling the quiet spaces of your kitchen. "You do not have to carry this alone anymore." You swallowed hard, your throat feeling as though it were lined with sandpaper. You kept your gaze firmly fixed on the dark liquid in your coffee mug, completely unable to look her in the eye. When you finally opened your mouth to speak, your voice was nothing more than a fragile, broken whisper, completely devoid of the polite confidence you had been faking all morning. "They aren't who you think they are," you managed to say, the words catching in your throat. You stopped, instantly terrified by what you had just admitted. You half expected Claire to instantly withdraw her hand, to offer a quick, defensive rebuttal about how wonderful and generous they were to the community. But Claire's hand remained perfectly steady over yours. "Okay," she replied softly, her tone incredibly gentle and completely free of judgment. Encouraged by that one simple validating word, you took a deep, shuddering breath and pushed a little further into the frightening territory of the truth. You didn't tell her everything. You didn't describe the suffocating atmosphere of the locked room, or the specific, calculated cruelty of the words that had been weaponized against you. You were not yet ready to expose the deepest, most tender parts of the wound. But you were finally willing to admit that the wound existed. The person they play on a stage. The person who gives to charity and smiles for the cameras. That isn't the real them, you confessed. A fresh, hot tear spilling over your lower lash line and dropping silently onto the wooden table. Behind closed doors, they hurt me. They hurt me so deeply, Claire. And they made sure that no one else was around to see it. They made sure that if I ever tried to tell anyone, I would look like a crazy, bitter liar. The silence that followed your confession was completely different from the oppressive, suffocating silence of your empty house the night before. This silence was sacred. It was the profoundly holy space where an unbearable burden is finally divided. You squeezed your eyes shut, your heart hammering wildly against your ribs, terrified of the verdict she was about to deliver. Claire gently squeezed your hands. You slowly lifted your head, your vision blurred with unshed tears, and finally looked into her eyes. There was no pity there, and absolutely no defensive skepticism. Instead, her eyes were bright, with a fierce, unwavering compassion. "I believe you," Claire said quietly, the three most powerful words you could have possibly heard in that exact moment. "I am so incredibly sorry that you have been carrying that by yourself." The dam completely broke. The sheer, staggering relief of being believed, of finally having someone look at your hidden reality and validate its existence, completely overwhelmed your remaining defenses. You let out a ragged, messy sob, bowing your head as the tears you had been meticulously swallowing for months finally flowed freely and without restraint. Claire didn't offer you empty platitudes. She didn't try to wrap your profound grief in a neat, cheerful bow or forcefully quote scriptures at you to fix your pain. She simply stood up from her chair, walked around the small kitchen table, and wrapped her arms tightly around your trembling shoulders. She held you while you wept, providing the physical, tangible comfort that your weary soul had been starving for. In that beautiful, tear-soaked moment, I was fulfilling an ancient promise through the arms of your friend. I have told my children to comfort those in any trouble with the comfort they themselves have received from me. Claire had walked through her own dark, hidden valleys years ago. She knew exactly what it felt like to be entirely misunderstood. And because she had allowed me to heal her past wounds, she was uniquely equipped to sit with you in the middle of yours. She was acting as my hands and my heart, proving to you in the physical realm that you were completely safe. As you cried against her shoulder, something remarkable began to happen deep within your chest. The massive, suffocating boulder of isolation that you had been dragging around for so long finally cracked down the center. You realized, with a profound sense of awe, that the enemy's greatest weapon against you had been completely disarmed. The lie that you were entirely alone, the terrifying threat that no one would ever care about your side of the story, had just been effortlessly dismantled by the grace of a supportive friend. I thought I had to hide it. You whispered against her shoulder, your voice thick with exhaustion and relief. I thought if I ever said it out loud, it would somehow make it more real, or it would ruin everything. You never have to hide with me, Claire replied softly, gently smoothing the back of your hair. And you don't have to protect their reputation at the expense of your own heart. Your healing is so much more important than their public image. Her words washed over you like a cool, healing balm. You took a deep, shuddering breath, filling your lungs entirely, for what felt like the very first time in over a year. The physical environment of the kitchen had not changed, and the external reality of the betrayal had not been magically erased, but the internal landscape of your heart had just undergone a massive, seismic shift. By taking that tiny, terrifying step of vulnerability, you had invited light into a space that had only known darkness. And in doing so, you inadvertently opened a door in your spirit that had been tightly bolted shut. As Claire returned to her seat and quietly refilled your coffee mug, allowing you the time and space to compose yourself, a new, gentle realization began to quietly bloom in the center of your mind. You looked down at your hands, still slightly trembling, but no longer clenched in defensive fists. If a human friend, with all her imperfections and limitations, could offer you this level of profound safety and unconditional belief, how much more safe were you in the hands of your Creator? If Claire could sit across from you, see the messy, broken fragments of your hidden pain, and respond with such pure, unwavering compassion, then perhaps my love for you was not nearly as distant or conditional as you had feared. The fragile spark of faith that had been ignited the night before on your living room floor was suddenly given the oxygen it needed to burn a little brighter. The walls of your fortress were finally coming down. My child, not violently, but gently, brick by willing brick. You were finally beginning to understand that the truest path to peace was not found in hiding your wounds, but in trusting them to the light. You wiped your eyes, taking a warm sip of the fresh coffee, entirely unaware that this beautiful moment of human connection was merely the prelude to a much deeper, profound surrender that was waiting for you just around the corner. When Claire finally wrapped you in one last, lingering hug and stepped out onto your front porch, the afternoon sun was beginning to cast long, golden shadows across the neighborhood. You stood in the open doorway, watching her car back out of the driveway and disappear down the quiet suburban street. For the first time in over a year, you did not feel the urgent, frantic need to slam the heavy door shut and instantly lock out the world. Instead, you lingered there for a moment, letting the gentle breeze wash over your face, breathing in the scent of cut grass and blooming jasmine. You softly pushed the door closed, the familiar click of the latch echoing in the entryway. But as you turned to face your empty house, the atmosphere was profoundly different. The oppressive, suffocating silence that had driven you to your knees just 24 hours earlier had vanished. The rooms were still quiet, yes, but it was a warm, settling quiet. The peaceful stillness of a sanctuary, rather than the terrifying isolation of a prison cell. You walked back into the kitchen and carried the 2 empty coffee mugs to the sink. As you turned on the faucet, letting the warm water rush over your hands, a profound, physical lightness settled into your bones. You had survived. You had spoken the terrifying, unspeakable truth out loud, and the sky had not fallen. You had laid your deepest, most heavily guarded wound bare before another human being, and instead of the crushing judgment you had anticipated, you had been met with pure, validating love. I was watching the tension melt away from your posture, my child. I saw the way your shoulders finally dropped to their natural position, the way the tight, anxious knot in your stomach uncoiled. This was the beautiful, undeniable power of walking in the light. The enemy had convinced you that your secret was keeping you safe, but it was only keeping you sick. By choosing to share your burden, you had successfully broken the terrible spell of isolation. You dried your hands on a small kitchen towel and made your way into the living room. Your eyes immediately fell upon the old, leather-bound Bible still resting on the center of the coffee table, exactly where you had placed it that morning. Only a day ago, that book had felt like an intimidating, foreign object. Now, it looked like a lifeline. You sat down on the edge of the couch and reached for it, not out of absolute, sobbing desperation this time, but out of a quiet, genuine hunger. You opened the pages, letting them fall naturally, and you began to talk to me. You didn't yell, and you didn't cry the agonizing, violent tears of the night before. You simply spoke in a soft, conversational whisper, as if I were sitting right there on the cushion next to you, because I was. I don't know what to do next. You confess to the empty room, your fingers lightly tracing the thin edge of the pages. I feel a little better, God. I feel like I can finally breathe. But I know this isn't the end of it. The pain is still there. How do I actually heal from this? It was a beautiful, courageous question. You were no longer just surviving. You were actively seeking restoration. Over the next several days, a new, gentle rhythm began to take root in your life. You started waking up just a few minutes earlier, using the quiet stillness of the dawn to sit with me before the demanding rush of your workday began. You began to bring me your small daily anxieties, learning to trade your exhausting hypervigilance for my enduring peace. We were celebrating small victories together. You were sleeping through the night without waking up in a cold sweat. You were smiling at your coworkers, and for the first time in a very long time, the smile actually reached your eyes. Your spirit was becoming softer, the cynical edges of your heart slowly wearing down under the constant, steady current of my grace. But I knew, and deep down you knew as well, that there was a massive, daunting mountain still standing in the distance. You could walk around the base of it for a while, enjoying the beautiful scenery of your newfound relief. But eventually, if you wanted to be entirely free, you were going to have to climb it. It happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. You were sitting in your favorite armchair, a warm cup of tea resting on the side table, reading a passage from the letters of Paul. Your eyes scanned down the page, moving smoothly through the ancient text, until you hit a single, unavoidable verse that brought your entire body to a sudden, screeching halt. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. The word forgive seemed to jump off the page, flashing like a brilliant, glaring neon sign in the quiet of your living room. Instantly, the old, familiar defenses flared up. You slammed the Bible shut, the sudden, sharp noise echoing off the walls, and you stood up from the armchair, your heart pounding a rapid, angry rhythm. You began to pace back and forth across the carpet, shaking your head in vehement denial. No, you whispered fiercely, wrapping your arms around your chest. No, God, please do not ask me to do that. You can ask me to let go of the anger. You can ask me to move on with my life, but do not ask me to forgive them. They don't deserve it. I listened to your pacing, feeling the profound, protective terror rising up in your spirit. I completely understood your resistance, my beloved child. The world has taught you a severely distorted version of forgiveness. You have been told that forgiving someone means you are excusing their terrible behavior. You believe that if you forgive the person who betrayed you in that locked room, you are somehow saying that what they did was acceptable, or that it didn't really matter. You fear that forgiveness is a pardon that will completely invalidate the agonizing months of suffering you have endured. But that is a devastating lie. Forgiveness is not for them. I whispered gently to your racing heart, my voice a steady anchor in your sudden storm. Forgiveness is for you. It is the only key that will unlock the door to the prison you have been living in. You stopped pacing and stood perfectly still in the center of the room, staring blindly at the dark window pane. To hold on to unforgiveness is to drink a deadly poison and wait for the other person to die. You had spent over a year remaining completely tied to your abuser through the heavy iron chains of your own bitterness. Every time you rehearsed their cruelty in your mind, every time you felt that sickening drop in your stomach at the mention of their name, you were allowing them to continue hurting you from afar. True, lasting healing meant you had to sever that chain. It meant you had to release your absolute right to revenge and hand the scales of justice entirely over to me. I can't do it, you sobbed softly, the anger draining out of you, leaving only a profound, exhausted inadequacy. You sank to your knees on the rug, staring down at your empty, trembling hands. I want to be free, God. I want to let it go, but I physically cannot find it in my heart to forgive them. The hurt is just too deep. I don't have the strength to do this. I know you don't, I replied softly, wrapping my arms around your kneeling frame. That is exactly where I need you to be. You did not need to manufacture a miraculous feeling of goodwill toward the person who broke your heart. You simply needed to bring me your total inability to forgive, and let me provide the strength that you were entirely lacking. Forgiveness is rarely a sudden, magical event. It is a difficult, intentional journey that begins with one single, willing step. You bowed your head, your tears falling silently onto the woven fabric of the rug, and you prayed the most honest, beautiful prayer of your entire life. You didn't use big, theological words, and you didn't try to sound spiritually mature. You simply gave me the shattered pieces of your willingness. Father, you whispered, your voice breaking in the quiet room. I don't want to forgive them. I still want them to pay for what they did. But I am so tired of being bitter. I am so tired of carrying them around with me everywhere I go. So please, help me want to forgive them. Change my heart. Give me your grace, because I have absolutely none of my own. In Jesus' name, amen. You stayed on your knees for a few minutes, letting the simple, profound honesty of that prayer echo in the spiritual realm. When you finally opened your eyes and stood up, a new, remarkable sensation washed over you. You did not feel an instant rush of absolute affection for your abuser. The pain was still a part of your story, but a massive, heavy block of resentment had undeniably shifted. You felt a rising tide of peaceful determination. You had finally invited me into the deepest, darkest, and most protected corner of your wound. You were no longer hiding from the pain. You were actively facing it, trusting that my grace would be sufficient to pull you through the agonizing process of letting go. You walked into your bedroom that night with your head held a little higher, feeling a quiet, enduring strength taking root in your soul. You were finally on the path to total freedom, and you were determined to see it through. But the enemy of your soul despises progress, my child. When he sees a heart beginning to heal, he will desperately try to rip the stitches out before the wound can fully close. The very next afternoon, you walked down your driveway to the small metal mailbox standing near the curb, humming a quiet tune, completely oblivious to the trap that had been set. You pulled open the little door and reached inside, grabbing a stack of glossy advertisements and white envelopes. You began sifting through the mail as you walked back up the concrete path toward the safety of your front door. You flipped past a utility bill and a brightly colored flyer for a local grocery store. And then, your thumb slid an innocent-looking ivory envelope to the front of the stack. You stopped dead in your tracks, your sneakers freezing against the concrete. The quiet tune died instantly in your throat. Your eyes locked onto the front of the envelope, staring at the distinct, looping handwriting that spelled out your name. It was handwriting you would recognize anywhere in the world. It was the precise, deliberate penmanship of the person who had locked you in that room, reaching out from the past to drag you straight back into the terrifying shadows of your deepest trauma. The sudden, icy shock of recognition paralyzed you exactly where you stood on the warm concrete of your driveway. The cheerful afternoon sun was still shining brightly overhead. The neighborhood birds were still singing in the old oak tree near your porch, and the distant sound of a lawnmower hummed in the background. Yet your internal world had just plunged into a freezing, suffocating winter. You stared down at the small, ivory envelope resting in the palm of your hand, completely unable to tear your eyes away from the looping, meticulous cursive ink that spelled out your name. It was them. There was absolutely no mistaking that handwriting. You had spent years studying the precise slant of those letters on birthday cards, thank you notes, and shared documents. It was the handwriting of the person who had smiled warmly at you in public, and then mercilessly dismantled your spirit in the terrifying privacy of a locked room. The small stack of grocery flyers and utility bills slipped from your suddenly numb fingers, scattering across the driveway and fluttering gently into the green grass. But you did not even notice they were gone. All of your focus, all of your rapidly accelerating heart rate, was entirely locked onto that single piece of paper. It felt as though the envelope itself were burning a hole straight through your skin. A violent, nauseating wave of pure adrenaline crashed over you, stealing the oxygen straight from your lungs and making the quiet suburban street tilt dizzyingly around you. You were no longer the healing, hopeful woman who had just poured out her heart in a brave, honest prayer. In the span of a single heartbeat, you were entirely reduced back to the terrified, defenseless victim standing on a faded rug, listening to the heavy wooden door click shut. You gasped, your survival instincts violently overriding your shock. You spun around on your heel, your sneakers scraping harshly against the concrete, and you practically sprinted up the walkway toward your front porch. You fumbled frantically with the doorknob, your hands shaking so severely that you dropped your keys twice before finally managing to thrust the brass key into the lock. You threw your weight against the heavy wood, shoving the door open and stumbling into the cool, shadowed entryway of your home. You slammed the door shut behind you, instantly throwing the deadbolt and sliding the heavy chain into place with a sharp, metallic clatter. You leaned your back heavily against the solid wood, your chest heaving with ragged, frantic breaths, clutching the ivory envelope against your collarbone as if it were a physical weapon. But locking the door did not bring the familiar rush of safety it usually provided. The threat was not outside waiting on the porch. The threat was right there, resting in the palm of your trembling hand, having successfully breached the walls of your most private sanctuary. They had found a way to reach you. Even here, in the quiet home where you had painstakingly tried to rebuild your shattered peace, the ghost of your past had effortlessly walked right through the walls. You pushed yourself away from the door and walked unsteadily into the kitchen, dropping the envelope onto the granite countertop as if it were coated in a deadly poison. You backed away from the island, creating as much physical distance between yourself and the piece of paper as the small room would allow. As you stood there, staring at the crisp white rectangle resting innocently on the dark stone, the initial shock began to recede, rapidly replaced by a surging, blinding wave of absolute rage. How dare they? The question echoed violently in your mind, burning with the hot, familiar sting of extreme injustice. How dare they write to you, after everything they had done, after the months of agonizing silence and the terrifying threats that had forced you to carry their dark secret? What could they possibly have to say? Were they writing to demand more silence? Were they sending a casual, glossy invitation to one of their celebrated charity events, completely oblivious to the trauma they had inflicted, just to mock your pain? Or worse, was it a carefully crafted, manipulative apology designed entirely to make them feel better about their own cruelty without offering any genuine repentance? The bitterness you thought you had surrendered the night before roared back to life with a terrifying ferocity. It clawed at your throat and flooded your chest, burning hotter and brighter than ever before. You crossed your arms tightly, digging your fingernails into your own sleeves as a profound, devastating sense of defeat washed over you, instantly drowning the fragile hope you had been so carefully tending. It was all a lie, you whispered to the empty kitchen, your voice cracking with a raw, agonizing despair. None of it was real. I'm not healing at all, my precious child. I felt the heavy, crushing weight of your disappointment in that exact moment. I saw the way you looked at that envelope and immediately concluded that your faith had failed, that your heartfelt prayers were completely useless, and that the beautiful, tear-soaked relief you had experienced with Claire was nothing more than a pathetic, temporary illusion. You believed that because the anger had returned, and because the fear was suddenly making your hands shake all over again, you had somehow lost all of your spiritual progress. You thought you had been thrown entirely back to square one. But I need you to understand a vital, enduring truth about the human heart. Healing is never a straight, unbroken line ascending smoothly toward perfect peace. It is a rugged, uneven mountain path. There are moments of breathtaking elevation where the air is clear and the sun is shining, and there are sudden, unexpected switchbacks that plunge you right back into the dark, shadowed valleys. A setback is not a sign of failure. It is a completely natural part of the restorative process. The fact that your wounds ached when they were violently bumped by the sudden appearance of this letter did not mean the wounds were not closing. It simply meant you were still human, still breathing, and still navigating a deeply broken world. When the ancient king wrote the words of Psalm 23, he did not proclaim that I would permanently remove every single enemy from his sight. He did not say that the dark valleys would instantly vanish the moment he began to pray. He wrote, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." And he declared, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Do you see the profound promise hidden within those words, my beloved? I do not always sweep the enemies away. Sometimes I invite you to sit down and feast on my peace right in the very middle of their presence. That ivory envelope was resting on your kitchen counter, radiating toxic memories and demanding your absolute terror. But it held absolutely no real authority over your soul unless you willingly handed that authority over to it. The ghost of your past was standing in your house, but I was standing there too. You didn't know how to grasp that truth yet. You were entirely consumed by the roaring storm of your own panicked thoughts. You stared at the letter, your mind spiraling into a dozen different, terrifying scenarios of what might be written on the folded paper inside. You wanted to march over to the counter, rip the envelope to shreds without even opening it, and throw the pieces into the trash. You wanted to burn it in the sink and watch the crisp white paper turn to black ash. But another part of you, a small, terrified voice in the back of your mind, whispered that you had to know. You had to know what they were saying, because staying in the dark felt just as dangerous as stepping into the light. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of the internal conflict was too much for your exhausted nervous system to handle. You let out a long, ragged breath, stepping backward, putting even more distance between yourself and the granite island. "I can't," you murmured, shaking your head slowly, your eyes wide with unresolved fear. "I just can't do this right now. Not today." You turned your back on the envelope, leaving it sitting there in the quiet kitchen, a silent, unexploded bomb resting in the heart of your home. You walked slowly out of the room, your footsteps heavy and dragging on the hardwood floor, retreating toward the familiar, comforting shadows of your living room. You sank down onto the edge of the couch, resting your elbows on your knees and burying your face in your hands. The physical toll of the sudden adrenaline spike left you feeling entirely hollowed out, your muscles aching with a deep, profound fatigue. The tears did not come this time. Instead, there was just a vast, empty numbness stretching out across your spirit. You felt incredibly fragile, like a house of cards that had just been flattened by a careless gust of wind. You sat there in the quiet, the ticking of the wall clock, perfectly echoing the relentless, unavoidable truth. Retreating to the living room had provided a temporary physical reprieve, but the psychological reality remained entirely unchanged. The letter was still there. The past had officially caught up with the present, and ignoring it was no longer a viable option for your survival. I sat beside you on the cushions, my presence a steady, unwavering anchor in the center of your swirling doubt. I was not rushing you to stand back up, and I was certainly not demanding that you immediately march into the kitchen and face your giant. I was simply holding the space for you, wrapping my grace around your trembling shoulders while you weathered the violent aftershocks of the trigger. You were standing at the edge of the most important precipice of your entire healing journey. This was the moment where the beautiful, abstract theories of faith collided violently with the harsh, terrifying realities of the physical world. The safe, polite walls you had lived behind for over a year were lying in ruins at your feet, and you were faced with an agonizing, unavoidable choice. You could easily bend down, pick up the heavy, familiar bricks of bitterness, isolation, and silent suffering, and begin the exhausting work of rebuilding the fortress to keep the world out. You could let this sudden setback convince you that healing was impossible, resigning yourself to a life permanently defined by the wounds inflicted in that locked room. Or you could choose to do something entirely terrifying. You could choose to step forward with empty, trembling hands, leaving the bricks on the ground, and actively trust that my grace was actually strong enough to hold you together when you finally opened that envelope. The shadows in your living room continued to stretch and deepen, marking the slow, agonizing passage of time as you sat perfectly still on the edge of the couch. I remained right beside you, honoring the heavy silence of the room, allowing you the space to gather whatever fragile courage remained in your exhausted spirit. You stared blankly at the floorboards, your mind locked in a furious, terrifying debate between the safety of your hardened walls and the dangerous, unknown territory of profound trust. You knew, with an inescapable certainty, that you could not stay in this paralyzed state forever. The envelope sitting on the kitchen counter was a physical anchor, holding you hostage in your own home. If you left it there unopened, its presence would dictate your every thought and poison your every breath. Finally, you took a deep, shuddering intake of air, planting your feet firmly on the rug. You pushed yourself up from the cushions, your legs trembling slightly, and began the long, dreadful walk back into the kitchen. The ivory envelope was resting exactly where you had abandoned it on the dark granite island. You stood before it, your heart hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against your ribs. Slowly, you reached out and picked it up. The paper felt unnaturally heavy in your hands. You slid your finger under the sealed flap, tearing it open with a sharp, harsh rip that echoed loudly in the quiet room. You reached inside and pulled out the contents. It was not a long, groveling letter of apology, nor was it a threat. It was a thick, glossy invitation to a prestigious charity gala, and tucked behind it was a physical photograph from years ago. You stared down at the image, feeling the oxygen rapidly evacuate your lungs. It was a picture of the two of you, taken just weeks before the betrayal. In the photograph, you were smiling brightly, leaning trustingly against the person who would soon lock you in a room and systematically destroy your peace. Clipped to the photograph was a small, handwritten note. You recognized the immaculate looping cursive immediately. Found this old picture and thought of you. I hope you are doing well. We should catch up soon. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of those casual words acted as a spark to a massive powder keg. A blinding, all-consuming wave of rage crashed over you, hotter and more violent than anything you had experienced thus far. Your jaw clenched so tightly your teeth ached, and your knuckles turned stark white as you gripped the edges of the photograph. How dare they? How dare they send you a picture of your own naive trust, acting as if the agonizing trauma they inflicted was nothing more than a minor misunderstanding that could be resolved over a casual cup of coffee. In that explosive moment, the temptation to let bitterness completely take over was overwhelming. You wanted to destroy them. You wanted to take this photograph, march into that charity gala, and scream the ugly, devastating truth in front of everyone who blindly adored them. You wanted to tear down their pristine public image and force them to experience the exact same paralyzing humiliation and terror they had forced upon you. Every single cell in your body screamed for retaliation. It felt entirely justified. It felt like your absolute, undeniable right to demand justice. My beloved child, I whispered, my voice cutting through the deafening roar of your internal storm with a gentle, unwavering authority. I know the fire burning in your chest. I see the gross injustice of this note. You squeezed your eyes shut, hot tears of absolute fury spilling over your lashes. It isn't right, you choked out, your voice a ragged, desperate rasp in the empty kitchen. They shouldn't get away with this. They shouldn't be allowed to pretend they are innocent. They are not getting away with it, I assured you, wrapping my presence around your trembling frame. Nothing they have done has escaped my perfect justice. But vengeance is mine. I will repay. The words from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans hung in the air between us, a profound, challenging invitation to lay down your weapons. I was not asking you to deny the horrific reality of what happened, nor was I asking you to invite this person back into your life. Reconciliation requires two willing, repentant hearts, but forgiveness only requires one. I was asking you to release your white-knuckled grip on the scales of justice, because holding on to the desire for revenge was only keeping you tethered to the very person you were trying to escape. You stared down at the photograph in your trembling hands. You realized, in a sudden, blinding flash of spiritual clarity, that this piece of paper was a tangible symbol of your bondage. If you allowed this manipulative note to dictate your emotional state, if you let it rebuild the walls of bitterness in your heart, then they would still be controlling you. They would still be holding the key to your peace. The climax of your long, agonizing journey had finally arrived. It was not a grand, cinematic battle against an external enemy. It was a quiet, desperate war, fought entirely within the borders of your own soul. I can't carry them anymore, you whispered, the fierce, burning anger suddenly giving way to a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. You looked up toward the ceiling, your face bathed in the soft glow of the kitchen pendant lights, and you made the greatest, most difficult decision of your entire life. You chose to open your hands. God, I surrender my right to get even. You prayed aloud, your voice shaking, but growing remarkably steady with each passing syllable. I surrender my need to see them punished. I trust that you are the righteous judge, and I am leaving them entirely in your hands. You took a deep breath, looking directly at the smiling face of your abuser in the photograph. I forgive you, you said clearly into the empty room. You didn't scream the words, and you didn't whisper them in defeat. You spoke them with the quiet, unshakable authority of a captive who has just discovered the door to their cell was unlocked the entire time. I forgive you, you repeated, your voice ringing with absolute finality. You do not owe me anything anymore. You no longer have any power over my heart, my mind, or my future. I release you. The moment the final word left your lips, you let the photograph and the glossy invitation slip from your fingers. They fluttered harmlessly down into the metal trash can beside the counter, landing softly among the discarded coffee grounds and crumpled paper towels. You did not tear them up. They were no longer important enough to warrant an angry response. They were simply trash. What happened next was not an emotional illusion. It was a palpable, physical miracle. The moment you released your grip on the bitterness, a massive, invisible weight physically lifted off your chest. It was as if you had been carrying a 100-pound stone backpack for over a year, and someone had just decisively severed the straps. You gasped, your lungs expanding to their absolute fullest capacity without hitting the familiar, suffocating wall of anxiety. A profound, supernatural peace The peace that completely transcends human logic and understanding, washed over you like a warm, rushing river. It started at the crown of your head and traveled slowly all the way down to the soles of your feet, completely flushing the toxic adrenaline and fear out of your nervous system. Your hands entirely stopped shaking. The agonizing, persistent knot in your stomach completely dissolved. You stood in your kitchen, the very room where you had felt so utterly trapped and terrified just moments before. And you smiled. It was not the forced, polite mask you wore for your coworkers. It was a genuine, radiant smile of absolute freedom. You were no longer a victim hiding in the shadows. You were a deeply loved child of God, standing firmly in the brilliant, healing light of His grace. The battle was over, and the heavy yoke had finally been traded for rest. You turned away from the trash can, leaving the ghost of your past exactly where it belonged. The evening stretched out before you, completely empty of dread and brimming with a quiet, joyful anticipation you had not felt in years. You turned away from the small metal trash can, leaving the physical remnants of your past exactly where they belonged. And as you walked back into the center of your living room, the very atmosphere of your home felt entirely transformed. The heavy, oppressive silence that had haunted your hallways for over a year had completely vanished. In its place was a rich, settling stillness, the kind of quiet that feels like a warm, thick blanket on a cold winter night. You stood in the middle of the room, entirely amazed by the profound, physical lightness in your own limbs. It was as if the gravity in the room had been miraculously adjusted. My beautiful child, this is the profound reality of exchanging your heavy burdens for my gentle peace. For so many agonizing months, you had been dragging around a massive, suffocating yoke of bitterness, trying to single-handedly manage the devastating scales of justice. You had exhausted yourself trying to carry a weight I never designed your shoulders to bear. But the moment you opened your hands and chose to forgive, you unclasped that terrible, crushing collar. You traded your agonizing vigilance for my perfect rest, and the immediate relief you felt in your physical body was merely an echo of the massive spiritual chains falling away from your soul. You walked over to the kitchen sink to pour yourself a glass of water, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, you actually tasted it. The simple, refreshing coolness of the water against your throat felt like a sheer luxury. You noticed the vibrant, cheerful color of the dish towels draped over the oven handle, and you heard the gentle, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator without feeling a sudden spike of anxiety. When a heart is no longer consumed by the frantic, exhausting work of guarding a hidden wound, it is finally free to experience the quiet, ordinary beauty of the present moment. You prepared a simple dinner that evening, moving around your kitchen with a gentle, relaxed grace, humming a soft tune that had absolutely nothing to do with avoiding your thoughts. That night, you did not toss and turn, violently wrestling with the ghosts of the locked room. You climbed into bed, pulled the soft covers up to your chin, and fell into a deep, restorative sleep the very moment your head touched the pillow. I stood watch over your room throughout the night, completely guarding your mind with the peace that transcends all human understanding. You were entirely safe, fully known, and completely unburdened. When the morning sun peeked through your window blinds the next day, you woke up before your alarm even had the chance to ring. You didn't wake up with that familiar, sickening drop in your stomach. You didn't immediately begin bracing yourself for the exhausting performance of the day. Instead, you opened your eyes, took a long, deep breath of the crisp morning air, and felt an undeniable, bubbling spring of joy rising in your chest. You swung your legs over the edge of the bed and planted your feet on the hardwood floor, not with the agonizing reluctance of a prisoner, but with the quiet, determined confidence of a woman who has just been set completely free. You went through your morning routine with a newfound, gentle rhythm. As you drove to work, the external world was exactly as it had always been. The traffic on the highway was still heavy. The sky was overcast with thick gray clouds, and the aggressive honking of impatient drivers still echoed down the concrete lanes. None of your external circumstances had magically rearranged themselves to make your life perfectly easy. The person who had betrayed you was still out there, likely still maintaining their pristine public image, and the rest of the world was still completely oblivious to the truth of what had happened behind those closed doors. But my child, the miraculous transformation had not occurred in the world around you. It had occurred entirely within you. The Apostle Paul wrote that the peace of God will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. You were experiencing the profound, literal reality of that promise as you navigated the morning commute. The injustice was still a factual reality of your past, but it had completely lost its venom. It was no longer a toxic, burning acid eating away at your joy. It was simply a scar, a permanent mark that told a story of survival, completely devoid of the sharp, agonizing pain of an open wound. You pulled into the crowded parking lot of your office building, turned off the ignition, and gathered your bag. You walked through the front glass doors, offering a bright, genuine smile to the receptionist sitting at the front desk. It wasn't the fragile, perfectly rehearsed mask you used to wear to hide your bleeding heart. It was a real, authentic expression of your internal lightness. You felt comfortable in your own skin again, no longer terrified that someone might accidentally look too closely and discover the shattered pieces you had been hiding. You settled into your desk chair, turned on your computer monitor, and took a sip of your warm coffee. But just as you opened your digital inbox to begin the workday, a sudden, unexpected test presented itself on the glowing screen. Right there, at the very top of your unread messages, was a company-wide email newsletter promoting local community events. And featured prominently in the center of the email, looking confident and universally beloved, was a high-resolution photograph of the exact person who had broken your heart. I watched you closely in that precise moment, my beloved. Only a few days ago, seeing that image unexpectedly pop up on your screen would have sent you spiraling into a devastating, breathless panic attack. Your hands would have shaken violently, your throat would have closed up, and you would have had to immediately flee to the restroom to hide your tears from your coworkers. The sheer injustice of seeing them celebrated would have completely ruined your entire week. But this morning was profoundly different. You sat there in your rolling office chair, staring directly at the photograph, and you waited for the agonizing, burning wave of panic to crash over you. You braced yourself for the nausea and the crippling fear. But the wave never came. There was a faint, distant echo of a memory, a slight recognition of the pain that used to live there. But the emotional cord connecting you to that trauma had been completely, permanently severed. You looked at the face of the person who had once held so much terrifying power over your mind, and you realized they were just a person. They were broken, flawed, and entirely unable to steal your peace ever again. The unforgiveness had been the very thing keeping their power alive in your life. And because you had chosen to release it, their image on the screen was nothing more than colorful pixels. A slow, brilliant smile spread across your face as the absolute magnitude of your freedom truly registered. You felt a rush of pure, unadulterated joy. You calmly moved your mouse, hovered over the little trash can icon at the top of the screen, and clicked delete without a single second of hesitation. The email vanished into the digital void, and you simply opened your next spreadsheet, entirely unbothered, your hands perfectly steady on the keyboard. Later that afternoon, as you were walking down the hallway toward the copy machine, you crossed paths with the very same acquaintance from the break room, the one who had inadvertently triggered your angry outburst just a few days prior. As they saw you approaching, I noticed them stiffen slightly, their eyes darting away nervously, clearly preparing for another awkward, hostile interaction. Before the forgiveness, you would have ducked your head in overwhelming shame and quickly hurried past them, letting the uncomfortable tension solidify the distance between you. But the peace inside your chest gave you a new, remarkable courage. You didn't run away. You stopped right there in the middle of the carpeted hallway and looked them directly in the eyes. "Hey," you said, your voice incredibly warm, entirely free of the jagged defensive edge that had cut them before. "I just wanted to apologize again for the other day. I was carrying a really heavy load of stress, and it was entirely wrong of me to snap at you like that. I am truly sorry." The acquaintance blinked, completely taken aback by your direct, humble honesty. The nervous tension immediately drained from their posture. They offered you a bright, forgiving smile, easily waving away the offense. "It's completely fine," they replied, their voice reflecting your warmth. "We all have hard days. It's really good to see you looking so well today." You nodded, wishing them a great afternoon, and continued walking down the hall. You felt as though you were walking on air. You had just navigated a potentially devastating trigger and successfully mended a broken bridge, all with a gentle, effortless grace that could only have come from my spirit working within you. You were no longer acting as the exhausted vault for someone else's toxic secrets. You were living as a brilliant, open vessel of my healing peace. When the workday finally ended, you walked out of the heavy glass doors of the office building and stepped into the golden, late afternoon sunlight. The cool breeze rustled through the trees lining the parking lot, and you took a moment to simply stand there, breathing deeply, savoring the profound, beautiful lightness of your own spirit. The internal war was officially over. The heavy yoke was permanently gone. You unlocked your car and slid into the driver's seat, completely ready to head back to the quiet sanctuary of your home. But as you put the key into the ignition, a quiet, resolute thought settled into your mind. The internal healing had taken root, and the spiritual ties had been severed. But you knew there was one final, physical step you needed to take to ensure this door was closed forever. You put the car into gear, feeling a deep, empowering certainty about exactly what you were going to do the moment you walked through your front door. You navigated the familiar route home with a steady, relaxed grip on the steering wheel, watching the late afternoon sun cast long, golden ribbons across the quiet suburban streets. The radio played softly in the background, a gentle, acoustic melody that perfectly matched the steady, unhurried rhythm of your newly liberated heart. When you pulled into your driveway, you didn't rush to the front door, looking for a secure place to hide. You walked up the concrete path, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped into your entryway with the calm, quiet authority of a woman who fully owned her space once again. You didn't even bother turning on the hallway lights to chase away the afternoon shadows. You simply didn't need to anymore. You walked straight to the small console table, picked up your cell phone, and opened your contact list. You scrolled until you found their name, the specific name that had once sent a freezing, paralyzing shockwave through your entire nervous system. Your thumb hovered over the glowing glass of the screen, but there was absolutely no hesitation, no residual fear, and no bitter, burning anger. You tapped the screen, deliberately selected the option to block the number, and confirmed it. You did the exact same thing for their email address and their social media profiles, erasing their digital footprint from your life. It was not an act of petty revenge, nor was it a dramatic, angry statement. It was simply a healthy, definitive boundary, a quiet closing of a door that should have been locked a year ago. You set the phone down on the table, feeling a profound, deeply satisfying click in your spirit. The access point was permanently severed, and you were officially out of their reach. The next few weeks unfolded like a beautiful, quiet melody, I watched you step back into the ordinary rhythm of your life, not as a fragile, terrified survivor tiptoeing around potential triggers, but as a vibrant, fully present participant. You started calling old friends again, the ones who had absolutely no connection to the trauma. You spent your evenings reading, baking, and sitting on your back patio, actually enjoying the cool evening air, instead of desperately trying to distract yourself from your own racing thoughts. You were finally standing fully in the healing light, and it looked absolutely beautiful on you, but true. Enduring transformation is always tested, my child. Not to make you fail, but to lovingly prove to you exactly how remarkably strong you have actually become. The final, gentle test arrived on a bright, bustling Saturday morning. You had decided to treat yourself, walking down to the busy little coffee shop in the center of town. The air inside was thick, with the rich scent of roasted espresso beans and warm, buttery pastries. The shop was crowded with weekend regulars, their cheerful, overlapping chatter blending seamlessly with the soft music playing from the overhead speakers. You ordered your favorite drink, tipped the barista with a warm, authentic smile, and turned around to find a small table by the large front window. As you navigated through the maze of small wooden chairs, you heard someone call your name. You paused and turned around, the warm paper cup held securely in your hands. Walking eagerly toward you was a woman from the old social circle, someone who was deeply involved in the charity committee led by your abuser. For a fraction of a second, the old, conditioned muscle memory flared up in your chest. A tiny whisper of the old survival instinct urged you to brace for impact, to immediately prepare your polite, defensive mask. But before that instinct could even fully take root, my perfect, prevailing peace simply washed it away. You stood your ground, your posture relaxed and open, and offered her a genuine, pleasant smile. "I thought that was you," she exclaimed, wrapping you in a quick, perfumed hug. "It has been absolutely ages. We have missed you so much at the planning meetings." You stepped back, keeping your expression soft. "It's good to see you too. I hope you've been doing well," you replied, your voice remarkably steady and calm. She smiled, her eyes dropping briefly to her designer handbag, before looking back up at you with a hopeful expression. "I have. Thank you. Actually, I'm so glad I ran into you today. The big gala is tonight, and a few of us were just saying how wonderful it would be if you made a surprise appearance. They even asked about you specifically yesterday, during the final walkthrough. I know they would be absolutely thrilled to see you there. It would mean the world to them." There it was, the final, delicate thread of the past, trying to pull you back into the exhausting performance. The old you, entirely crushed by the fear of disappointing others and desperate to maintain the fragile illusion of perfect harmony, would have immediately stammered out a weak excuse, feeling a sickening, heavy wave of guilt for declining. The old you would have spent the rest of the entire weekend agonizing over what they thought of you, terrified of their judgment. But you are not the old you anymore, my beautiful child." I watched as you looked at her, fully recognizing that she was completely unaware of the devastating darkness hiding behind the polished event she was promoting. You did not feel the desperate, burning need to expose the truth to her, nor did you feel any residual anger toward her blind loyalty. You simply felt a profound, gentle grace. "Thank you so much for the invitation," you said, your tone incredibly kind but carrying an unshakable, absolute firmness. "But I won't be able to make it. I wish you all a truly wonderful and successful evening, though." She blinked, perhaps a little surprised by the peaceful finality in your voice, but she quickly recovered her cheerful demeanor. "Oh, well, we will certainly miss you. Enjoy your coffee, and let's try to catch up properly soon." "Take care," you replied, giving her a final warm nod. You watched her walk out of the shop, the little bell above the glass door chiming merrily behind her. You took a slow sip of your coffee, savoring the rich, warm flavor, and a deep, immensely satisfying joy bubbled up from the very bottom of your soul. You had just faced the ghost of your past, wrapped in the innocent guise of a polite invitation. And you had not flinched. You had not compromised your hard-won peace. You had not anxiously defended yourself. And you had not let a single ounce of bitterness dictate your response. You had responded with unwavering kindness, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that the transformation inside of you was completely, undeniably real. As you walked out of the coffee shop and stepped into the bright, warming rays of the late morning sun, I spoke a profound, ancient truth into your spirit. The enemy had intended that closed room to be your complete and total destruction. The betrayal was meant to break your spirit, to silence your voice forever, and to lock you in a permanent, agonizing state of fear and isolation. What was intended for absolute harm, the deepest kind of interpersonal devastation, was a weapon forged specifically to ruin your life. But look at what I have done with it, my beloved. Look at how I took the shattered, bleeding pieces of your heart and used them to rebuild you infinitely stronger than you were before. What they intended for evil, I have completely repurposed for your good and for my eternal glory. Through this agonizing journey, you have discovered a deep well of resilience you never knew you possessed. You have learned exactly how to establish healthy, protective boundaries without losing your soft, gentle nature. You have developed a profound, empathetic compassion for others who are silently suffering, knowing exactly what it feels like to carry a heavy, invisible burden behind a forced smile. Most importantly, you have learned to lean on me in the absolute darkest of valleys, discovering firsthand that my grace is more than sufficient to carry you through the hottest fires. You are no longer easily shaken by the fleeting opinions of the crowd, because your identity is now firmly, securely anchored in my unconditional love for you. You spent the rest of your Saturday running simple errands, deeply enjoying the ordinary rhythm of a life that finally belonged entirely to you again. You bought a bouquet of fresh, yellow flowers for your kitchen counter. You laughed out loud at a joke the cashier made at the grocery store, and you drove home with the windows rolled down, letting the fresh, cool air tangle wildly in your hair. Every ordinary, peaceful moment felt like a massive, beautiful victory. When evening finally arrived, you pulled your car into your driveway, just as the sky was being painted in brilliant, sweeping strokes of lavender and gold. You gathered your bags from the passenger seat, walked up the concrete path to the front door, and unlocked it. You stepped inside, closing the heavy wooden door softly behind you. You did not immediately reach for the television remote or turn on the radio to artificially fill the empty space. You walked into the living room, set your keys on the side table, and simply stood there for a long, quiet moment. You listened closely to the absolute stillness of your home. For so long, the silence had been your absolute greatest enemy. It had been a deafening amplifier for your hidden pain and your racing, terrified thoughts. But tonight, the silence was entirely different. It felt like a thick, comforting blanket of peace wrapped around your shoulders. You realized, with a deep, contented sigh escaping your lips, that you were no longer afraid of the quiet. You were no longer afraid of your own company, because you knew, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that you were never truly alone. You sat down on the edge of the soft couch, resting your hands peacefully in your lap, completely ready to finally close this painful chapter of your life and look forward to the beautiful, unwritten tomorrow I have prepared for you. You sat there in the quiet of your living room, the soft evening shadows stretching peacefully across the floorboards. The profound, physical lightness in your chest remained absolute and unwavering. For over a year, you had firmly believed that safety could only be found in silence, that the only way to survive the devastating wounds inflicted behind closed doors was to meticulously hide them from the world. But as you rested your head against the back of the couch, breathing in the still, calm air of your home, you finally understood the breathtaking truth. True safety is never found in hiding. True safety is found in the arms of your Creator, standing fully exposed in the brilliant, healing light of His grace. I watched you trace the familiar, worn leather of the Bible resting on the coffee table. A gentle, authentic smile played across your lips as you reflected on the incredible distance you had traveled. You thought back to the agonizing mornings, where merely getting out of bed felt like lifting a boulder, and the terrifying afternoons spent trying to perfectly mask your panic. It felt like looking at a completely different person, a fragile, exhausted version of yourself that no longer existed. The internal and external battles had entirely ceased. You had faced the ghost of your past. You had released your white-knuckled grip on revenge, and you had allowed my supernatural peace to entirely rewrite your future. You were no longer defined by the trauma of what happened in the dark. You were defined by the magnificent, redemptive love that pulled you back into the light. My beautiful, brave child, I was with you for every single step of that journey. I caught every tear that fell onto your rug. I heard every jagged, angry question you shouted into the empty room, and I gently guided your trembling hands toward the ultimate source of truth. I saw what happened when no one else did, and I was the one who meticulously, tenderly stitched your shattered heart back together. What the enemy intended for your absolute ruin, I have masterfully repurposed into a beautiful testimony of enduring, unshakable strength. You are truly free. And now, as the dust settles on this chapter of the story, I want to gently shift my gaze. I want to speak directly to the heart of the one listening to these words right now. Yes, you. Perhaps you stumbled upon this message today, and as you listen to this journey of hidden pain and silent suffering, you felt a sharp, familiar ache in the center of your own chest. Perhaps you, too, are carrying a massive, invisible stone that was maliciously placed onto your shoulders behind closed doors. I know the immense, agonizing exhaustion you are battling. You have become an absolute master of the brave, public performance. You go to your workplace. You attend family gatherings. You sit in the pews of your church, and you offer everyone a bright, convincing smile, all while quietly bleeding from a wound that no one else in your life even knows exists. You may have been severely betrayed by someone you trusted, or perhaps you are navigating the devastating, silent grief of a broken marriage, a shattered friendship, or a private loss that feels entirely too complicated to explain to anyone else. You have swallowed your tears for so long that your throat permanently aches. In the darkest, loneliest hours of the night, when the distractions of the busy world fade away, you stare at the ceiling and wonder if your suffering is entirely invisible. You wonder if justice is just a myth, and if anyone in the universe truly understands the depth of the secret agony you are enduring. My precious beloved child, I want you to hear me with absolute clarity. I see it all. I am El Roy, the God who intimately, perfectly sees you. I am the God who stays incredibly close to the brokenhearted, and I save those who are completely crushed in spirit. I have seen every single tear you have quickly wiped away in your car before turning the key in the ignition. I have heard every fractured, desperate question that rattles endlessly in your weary mind. The world may be easily fooled by the composed, capable mask you wear every morning, but absolutely nothing that has wounded your heart has escaped my compassionate, loving eyes. The one who hurt you may believe they have successfully hidden their cruelty. They may be walking around with a pristine public reputation, celebrated by people who have absolutely no idea what they did in the dark. The sheer injustice of it makes you feel like you are losing your mind. But I assure you, earthly injustice does not erase heavenly justice. I am the righteous judge, and your pain is not a forgotten footnote in my kingdom. I keep track of all your sorrows, and I have collected every single one of your tears in my bottle. In the book of Lamentations, the prophet Jeremiah penned some of the most profound words in all of Scripture, and he wrote them while looking at the absolute, smoking ruins of his own life. In the midst of total devastation, he declared, "Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." I want you to let that ancient, enduring truth wash over your exhausted spirit right now. My compassions for you have not failed, even when you felt entirely abandoned. They will not fail tomorrow, and they will not fail 10 years from now. When you wake up tomorrow morning, you will not have to rely on yesterday's grace, because I will provide a completely new, fresh reservoir of mercy designed specifically for that day's unique struggles. You do not have to carry this crushing, toxic burden by yourself for another day. You do not have to fiercely protect the reputation of those who hurt you at the severe expense of your own soul. You are allowed to be incredibly tired. You are allowed to admit that the secret you have been carrying is simply too heavy for human shoulders. I am gently inviting you to make the exact same terrifyingly beautiful choice that you just witnessed in this story. Lay down your heavy, suffocating yoke. You do not have to manufacture a magical feeling of total forgiveness in this exact second. Forgiveness is a profound, challenging journey, and I only ask for your humble willingness to take the very first step. Open your tightly clenched fists and hand the devastating scales of justice entirely over to me. Let me step into the deeply locked rooms of your past and flood them with my perfect, enduring light. When you choose to release your bitter right to revenge, you are not saying that what happened to you was acceptable. You are simply declaring that your future peace is far more valuable than your past pain. What the enemy intended to completely destroy, you can be the very foundation I use to rebuild you. I can take the ashes of your deepest betrayal and turn them into a crown of profound empathy, unshakable faith, and radiant, lasting peace. I saw what happened. I have the power to heal the hurt, and I hold all of your tomorrows perfectly in my hands. As we close this chapter together, I want to invite you to take a deep, slow breath. Wherever you are right now, whether you are sitting in the quiet of your living room, resting in your parked car, or walking down a busy street, allow the heavy, exhausting armor you have been wearing to finally drop to the floor. Allow yourself to feel completely, entirely safe in my presence. Let us pray together, bringing all of the hidden, broken pieces directly to the one who knows exactly how to put them back together. Heavenly Father, thank you for being El Roy, the God who perfectly and intimately sees me. Thank you that I never have to hide my true, messy reality from your loving eyes, and that you never turn away from my pain. Lord, I am so incredibly tired of carrying this heavy, invisible burden all by myself. Today, I choose to surrender my hidden wounds, my deep bitterness, and my agonizing desire for revenge, placing them entirely into your capable, just hands. I ask for your supernatural grace to help me truly forgive those who have wounded me behind closed doors. I cannot do it on my own. Please wash my spirit completely clean of the toxic resentment that has kept me trapped in the past. Heal the deep, tender spaces in my heart that no one else sees, and bind up my broken spirit. Give me the profound courage to step out of the fearful shadows and walk confidently into your brilliant, restoring light. I fully trust that your compassions never fail, that your mercies are new every single morning, and that you hold all of my tomorrows securely in your grasp. In Jesus' holy name, amen.